Our next guest is someone I have been fascinated by for many years. Intriguingly, he was a co-founder of Greenpeace and served for 9 years as president of Greenpeace Canada and 7 years as a director of Greenpeace International. No. Put the remote down. Put it down. Stay with me. We haven't gone all lovey. This is Outsiders, remember. But despite all that, he became convinced that not only is carbon dioxide the cornerstone of all life and should be defended rather than demonised, he calls himself now the sensible environmentalist who is sceptical of the entire global warming, climate change, alarmism agenda. Patrick Moore, I hope I've done you justice. Welcome to Outsiders. Hi, Patrick.
Thanks. That was an outstanding editorial.
Thank you very much. Patrick, look, intriguingly, as I said, you were one of the co-founders of Greenpeace. Just quickly, I know you've told the story a zillion times. How did the shackles fall from your eyes and you did a bit of a U-turn and the left, of course, demonised you? We all know about that. Talk us through it.
Well, I had a lifelong interest in life sciences and biology, and then I learned about ecology in the mid-'60s before the word had even been mentioned in the media or the popular press of any kind. And I realized that through ecology, you could get an insight into the infinity of this universe and all of this life. It's about all the relationships between everything on Earth. And climate change is very much like that. There are so many factors, whether it's astrophysics or oceanography or atmospheric physics and all the weather events. It's amazing that they even think they could put this in a computer. And you can't, actually, because there's no such thing as a crystal ball, and they pretend that their computers are crystal balls when actually they're just a tool to try to find an answer to how to predict the future, which, with something so complicated as climate change, is simply not possible. So I started out in an academic setting doing a PhD in ecology back in the 60s and into the early 70s. And when I heard a small group of people was beginning to meet in a church basement in Vancouver to plan a protest voyage against U.S. I joined the group called the Don't Make a Wave Committee, and we became Greenpeace. And I stayed for 15 years in the top committee as we created Greenpeace International and went on to get into the Toxics campaign, the Save the Whales campaign, and all the other campaigns that I was very proud to work in, except I think the one mistake I made then was to fall into the anti-nuclear camp, and it was some years. Go ahead.
Rita.
What do you think of Greenpeace and the environmental movement now? We've got Extinction Rebellion who get a lot of attention. What's your judgment on these groups?
Well, the most extreme ones, like Extinction Rebellion, have become a kind of toxic mix of far-left political ideology and a religious cult. They dress up like a cross between some priests from the Spanish Inquisition and a Star Wars character. So that's just insane. But take Greenpeace, which still tries to make it seem as though they're acting as a legitimate group. You start out with noble intentions as volunteers like we did back in the day in '71. And you do a lot of hard work and you don't get paid. Eventually, though, you have to pay your staff and you get success and you have a payroll to meet. And then fundraising comes a little higher up onto the priorities for for what you do in the day. And before you know it, as it happens with Greenpeace, it turns into a racket. Because by the mid-'80s, we had basically addressed all the really pressing environmental issues of air and water pollution and many other of the issues. And now they just make up issues. The war on plastic, for example, is completely phony. And so is the GMO scare. And so is the worry about radiation from nuclear power plants. And I mean, imagine Australia with all this uranium and no nuclear plants. Slovakia gets 2/3 of its electricity from nuclear and bans uranium mining. I mean, it's all completely irrational, and much of it is based on bad media reporting and bad politics that's just taking advantage of people's ignorance of things. But in the final analysis, I think the environmental movement today is so far off onto the extreme left politically that it isn't an environmental movement anymore. And things like the Green New Deal in the United States and the same in Europe with zero, net zero emissions. This is a recipe for complete and total genocide, basically. I mean, we get 80% of our energy from fossil fuels worldwide, and they think it can be replaced with energies that just disappear most of the time. I mean, the factor on wind and solar is in the sort of 10 to 25% range most of the time when you can even get any electricity from them. So now they're talking about, what would end up being trillions of dollars worth of batteries that don't last forever either. And none of this is renewable. That's the thing that people have to understand. The solar panels and the wind turbines and the batteries are not made out of renewable things. Wood is renewable. That's the most important renewable thing there is on the whole earth is wood. Water, I guess you could say it's renewable, but it doesn't grow like trees do. And so that one of the really big problems is that the Greens have got control over management of resources in the hinterland where the mining and the forestry and fisheries and agriculture is going on, and they are living in a completely artificial urban environment, and there's a majority of urban people now. And the people of the country are being depicted as the enemies of the earth, when in fact what they're doing is supplying the people in the city with everything they need. Energy,
absolutely.
Food, to build the whole city.
James.
Patrick, I've been observing, for years now that this sort of green ecology, environmentalism is really a luxury good. Now that we're in an economic crisis across pretty much the entire world, where do you think the environmental movement goes? Will there just simply be no interest in that sort of thing as people look more towards making a living, or are they going to double down and try, in the course of making society post-coronavirus, to try and implement more harebrained, lunatic green schemes that will just wind up hurting the economy even further?
Well, many of them seem to support eternal lockdown. So that you don't use so much energy. Don't drive your car. You have to go to the store. How are we going to get the food into the cities? How we grow the food? People don't understand that big machinery can't be run on batteries, and there's a lot of big machinery in the world that is digging the ore for minerals, and is farming and is forestry and all these machineries. They can't be run on batteries, not the kind of battery we have now anyway. And we're using lithium, which is the latest element after hydrogen. And we're not going to find anything light to make batteries with. So that there are limits to technology. I don't think they understand that at all. They're living in a fairy tale world, and they're a very negative factor. They're even trying to blame coronavirus on, Trump climate change policy, but just climate change policy in general. And they seem to forget that the reason you get a cold is because it happens when it's cold, and it's influenza. These kinds of viruses don't survive well in hot climates. And I know, like Brazil has a bad problem. Most of the warm climates, Ethiopia has one death from the coronavirus, and there's 100 million people there. So it's very clear that this relationship between warmth and getting rid of the virus is a very good and healthy one. Let's have a little bit warmer world, and we would have less viruses and less colds.
Patrick, the Great Barrier Reef, I know you love nature, and you've written a lot about the fake science around the Great Barrier Reef, which is demonized here in Australia. Tell us your thoughts on it.
Well, yes, I have a ticket to scuba dive, and I've done quite a lot of that, and I haven't been on the Great Barrier Reef, but I've been on reefs that have even more biodiversity, up in Coral Triangle of Asia and Ampat, in those areas. And it's just so fascinating. But the truth is, the fundamental truth, the highest biodiversity, even the World Wildlife Funds recognizes this, the highest diversity in the world, in the Coral Triangle, the warmest oceans in the world. So how could it possibly be a problem for cooler oceans to get? And in fact, the triangle from a long-term of Eocene thermal maximum, this Pleistocene ice age that we're in now, those coral reefs represent kind of a sanctuary for the highest biodiversity. If the barrier reef had the same temperature, cool periods that are the biggest for biodiversity. There's papers very clear that marine ecosystem, the warmest, the most biodiverse, not just for coral, but for reef species, but for fish and other types of fish too. There's no doubt about it that warm oceans are more biodiverse than cold oceans, and warm climates like the tropical climate is more biodiverse than the North Pole. And when you go from warm, cold, biodiverse crashes as soon as freezing occurs, because frost and ice are the enemies of life. Few species have figured adapt to them.
Patrick, or a big fan of carbon dioxide, which kid in Australia is the most evil stuff. We've only got a minute. Tell us briefly carbon dioxide.
Carbon, the basis for life, which is on Earth. Dioxide in this last few million is lower in the history. Earth. You can going seen thermal max 50 million go back to Triassic, where 2005 parts per million declining since then, and 50 million years, and 50 because the marine species includes the corals, and all the mollusks and and krells, lobsters take carbon dioxide and carbonate to make carbonate coatings for them, armor plating, the CO2 the ocean, which the ocean from the atmosphere, and they did it on purpose. Reason to protect bodies. You think of how many species have a shell. That's the shell in the CO2 in the CO2. The other thing is, now in this place ice age, even though we're ice age, glacial period, a little blip of warmth, in the Pleistocene, the last ice, the last Heru, 160 million, after 100 million.